Okay, so you want to own a Spanish galleon. You commission a massive wooden fortress. You load it with bronze cannons. You sail it across the Atlantic. You fill the hull with silver pulled straight out of the mountain at Potosi, and you come home to Seville like a king of the New World. You are the master of the oceans, untouchable, legendary, and impossibly, unimaginably rich. Here is the problem. That picture, the floating treasure vault, is almost completely wrong. The biggest threat to your fortune was not Blackbeard. It was not the British Royal Navy. It was not even the hurricanes waiting for you in the Caribbean. The biggest threat to your fortune was the sheer, suffocating, never-ending cost of keeping a giant wooden box from sinking. And before we go one single inch further, let me say the one thing that actually matters here. If you enjoy history told through its receipts instead of its legends, subscribe right now, because everything on this channel runs on the same simple idea. The myth is loud, but the math is always louder. Hit that button and let us get into it. So let us talk about what it actually costs to own a Spanish galleon. Not the myth, the math. Before we start throwing enormous numbers at you, you need a ruler. You need to know what these numbers actually mean, down here, in your own pocket, today. So here is our anchor, and we are going to use one currency for this entire video so the math never slips. The coin of the Spanish Empire was the peso de a ocho, the famous piece of 8. You have heard pirates shout about it in 100 movies. It was a single silver coin worth 8 reales, and it is the only unit of money we will use from here to the very end. To understand what that coin was really worth, we look at the man at the bottom of the ladder. An unskilled laborer in 16th century Seville earned roughly 1.5 to 2 reales for a full day of hard work. That means a single piece of 8 was about 4 to 5 days of a working man's entire life. Now adjust that for modern purchasing power, measured against wages and the price of bread and wheat, and one piece of 8 lands somewhere around $80 to $100 today. We will use $100, just to keep the arithmetic clean. Hold on to that number, because we are about to multiply it many thousands of times, and every time we do, it is going to hurt a little more. And one honest note before we begin. These are not exact ledger entries copied out of a vault. They are careful reconstructions, built from surviving records, shipyard contracts, and payrolls, then rounded into round numbers so the scale stays clear. The exact peso count shifted from port to port and from year to year. But the shape of the money, where it went and who it went to, is very well documented, and that shape is the real story. Now here is the counterintuitive foundation this entire video is built on. When you build a galleon, you are not building a vehicle. You are founding a tiny, floating nation-state that is going to lose all contact with dry land for 6 straight months. And the very instant that little nation leaves the harbor, it begins to depreciate with every single wave that slaps against the hull. So let us build a galleon from scratch and watch the money leave. Here is what almost everybody assumes. They assume the most expensive part of building a warship is the weaponry. The cannons, the powder, the iron. Surely the guns are the big line item. It is not even close. A single galleon of 500 tons required around 3,000 mature oak trees. Not saplings. Old, slow-grown giants, some of them older than the men swinging the axes at them. The raw cost of a hull like this, framed, planked, and rigged, ran to roughly 45,000 pesos, which, in our money, is about $4.5 million. And the guns cost a fraction of that. Let me put that number in perspective for you. $4.5 million in the 16th century was enough to buy all of the farmland surrounding a small Spanish town. You are not buying lumber here. You are buying an entire forest and the ground it grows out of. But here is the twist, and this is the part nobody ever tells you. You are not just paying for the wood, you are paying to move the wood. Those 3,000 oaks did not grow conveniently next to the shipyard. They grew inland, up in the mountains, sometimes hundreds of miles from the coast. So you had to pay to cut fresh roads straight through the forest. You had to hire enormous teams of oxen. You had to drag each massive trunk over broken, muddy terrain for weeks at a time, all the way down to the shipyards near Cadiz. And for the hardest timber, hauled from the farthest forests, the cost of moving it could run several times the price of the tree itself. Let that land for a second. The shipping bill for the wood could dwarf the wood. You have not even reached the ocean yet, and the ocean is already winning. All right, the hull is finished. Now you have to keep 200 living, breathing human beings alive on top of it for half a year. Most people assume you simply pay a monthly wage and the problem is solved. But the wage is the easy part. The hard part is the food. Feeding 200 men for 6 months meant mountains of hardtack, that rock-hard, tooth-cracking sea biscuit, plus salted meat, dried fish, olive oil, chickpeas, and enormous barrels of wine. because the fresh water always went foul within a couple of weeks. The food bill for one voyage ran to roughly 15,000 pesos, and once you add the crew's wages on top, the whole human operation cost about 30,000 pesos for a year. In modern money, that is around $3 million just to keep your people fed and paid. Think about what that actually is. It is like paying the entire catering budget of a 4-star hotel. Except the hotel is floating in the middle of the open ocean, there is no refrigeration, no fresh delivery is ever coming, and if you run out, the guests do not check out. They die. And here is where it gets genuinely infuriating. It is the cost of spoilage. You paid for 100% of that food, but weevils, mold, rot, and rats devoured a punishing share of it, often something close to a third, before it ever reached a single sailor's mouth. So a huge slice of your grocery bill was, in effect, an extremely expensive buffet thrown for the rats living in your hull. You were not just feeding your crew. You were personally funding a lavish banquet for the vermin eating you alive from the inside out. And this is not some abstract spreadsheet exercise. Let me give you a real name. Pedro Menéndez de Avilés was one of the most powerful admirals Spain ever produced. He commanded entire treasure fleets. He founded settlements in Florida. He moved more silver across the Atlantic than most kings would ever lay their eyes on in a lifetime. And he spent much of his life quietly drowning in debt. To fund his voyages, he mortgaged his own property. He borrowed at brutal interest rates. And even as he hauled fortunes in silver back across the sea to Spain, the money never once stopped in his hands. It flowed straight through his fingers and into the vaults of his creditors, the bankers in Genoa, the lenders who had financed the whole enormous operation from the very beginning. He died still owing money. The silver passed through him. It did not stay with him. Remember that, because it is the entire story in a single life. The silver was completely real. The wealth was an illusion. Now, if you are still with me, stop for a second and look at exactly what we have covered. You have seen the wood. You have seen the wages. You have seen the rats. You have seen precisely where the physical, touchable, countable money goes. But we have not touched the expense that actually bankrupted galleon owners. The one you could not see. The one that did not rot, or leak, or sink. Remember the core of this entire thing. A galleon was never a floating treasure chest. It was a high-risk liability with sails bolted onto it. Because the biggest hand reaching into your pocket did not belong to a pirate. It belonged to the bureaucracy. Here is another thing everybody assumes. They assume that once the ship is built, it is a finished asset. You own it, it sits there quietly, and the only real cost left is moving it from one place to another. Wrong. A galleon was not an asset that sat still and held its value. It was a wound that never once closed. Every few months, you had to careen the ship, physically drag the entire vessel over onto its side, scrape off the tons of barnacles, seaweed, and marine growth clinging to the hull, and then repair the raw wood underneath. This cost thousands of pesos every single year, forever, for the entire working life of the ship. Imagine owning a supercar that legally required you to rip out and replace the entire chassis and the entire engine every 6 months, or else it would simply explode in your driveway. That is the maintenance reality of a wooden ship. And now meet the enemy right there in the title. Its name is Teredo Navalis, the shipworm. The moment your beautiful, brand new galleon touched salt water, these creatures began boring into the timber and eating your ship alive from the inside. They were small, silent, and utterly relentless. Left unchecked, a colony of them could riddle a hull with so many hidden tunnels that the wood would give out without a single warning crack. And here is the cruel part. A galleon sitting quietly at anchor, going nowhere, earning nothing, still rotted. It still demanded near-constant, expensive maintenance just to keep existing. You were not paying to sail the ship. You were paying, endlessly, just to stop it from decaying back into the sea. And now we arrive at the expense that truly finished people off. This is the invisible hand from a minute ago. This is the bureaucracy. You assume that hauling silver home from the Americas is the moment you finally get rich. And this is exactly where the empire leans in and reminds you who you actually work for. First came the Quinto Real, the royal fifth. The crown took a fifth of all precious metal straight off the top before you laid eyes on a single coin. Then came the Avaria, a tax that funded the armed fleets protecting the convoys. And here is where I want to be honest with you, because it matters. For much of the era, the Avaria was only a few percent. But in the bad years, driven by war, loss, and inflation, it spiked, climbing to a crushing share of your cargo's value right when you could least afford it. And then there was the money you borrowed just to make the voyage happen at all. These were bottom-rung loans, loans secured against the ship itself. And the Genoese bankers who issued them charged interest that, in the riskiest years, could climb toward 40%. Put all of that into modern terms. Imagine running a business that gets taxed hard on its revenue, and then, on top of that, pays punishing interest on the loan it needed just to be allowed to open its doors. And here is the detail that broke men. You, the owner, carried 100% of the risk. If a hurricane swallowed your ship, that was entirely your loss. The king did not share it. The bankers did not share it. But if your ship made it home safely, the king and the creditors would strip away an enormous share of the value before you were ever permitted to touch a single piece of silver. You took all of the risk. They took most of the reward. That is not a treasure hunt. That is a trap with a flag planted on top of it. So let us add it all up. Let us run the complete invoice for one single galleon, on one single voyage, in one single currency. The hull, the masts, and the sails, 45,000 pesos, about $4.5 million. The cannons and the armament, 15,000 pesos, about $1.5 million. The food and the wages for the crew for one full year, 30,000 pesos, about $3 million. The Avaria tax and the loan interest for that first voyage, 40,000 pesos, about $4 million. Add it all together, and your total initial investment for one ship comes to roughly 130,000 pesos, about $13 million. For one galleon. Now remember, Spain did not send out one lonely galleon. It sent entire fleets. Multiply that $13 million across a convoy of 50 ships, and you are suddenly staring at an amount of money large enough to break a modern nation. Let me anchor that for you in 3 ways you can actually feel. $13 million for one ship is roughly the price of one large, top-of-the-line private jet today, a Gulfstream. One galleon equals one billionaire's airplane. It is also more than the entire development budget of a modern blockbuster video game, the kind that takes a studio of hundreds of people 5 years of their lives to build. And the biggest one of all, outfitting a full fleet of these ships for a single voyage, cost more than the entire modern annual economic output of small island nations like Tuvalu or Nauru. One voyage. More than a whole country produces in an entire year. And every peso of it was floating on salt water, 1,000 miles from home, one bad storm away from vanishing forever. So here is the truth sitting underneath the legend. A Spanish galleon did not make you rich. Owning a galleon correctly, understanding its catastrophic financial gravity, respecting the taxes and the shipworms and the rats and the storms all at once, that is what separated the merchants who founded global empires from the men who ended up quietly rotting away in a debtor's prison in Seville, still owing money on a ship that was already resting at the bottom of the sea. It was never a treasure chest. It was just math on water. If you want more history read through its math, subscribe. Next time, the economics of owning a gladiator school, where the single biggest expense was not buying the men. It was stopping them from destroying your profit margin before they ever set foot in the arena.